The airplane cabin buzzed with the typical energy of pre-flight preparations. Passengers shuffled to find their seats, the clicks of overhead compartments punctuating the air, while flight attendants moved through the aisles, their polite smiles setting the tone for the journey ahead. Everything seemed ordinary until a sharp, piercing voice disrupted the calm. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" The accusatory words came from Linda, a middle-aged woman in a pressed white blouse and tan slacks. Her gaze, cold and confrontational, was fixed on a poised black woman seated near the window in the business class section. The woman looked up from her book, her expression calm but inquisitive. "I'm sorry, is there an issue?" Linda's face hardened, her brow furrowing as she gestured toward the seat. "Yes, there is. This seat isn't for someone like you. Business class is for people who can actually afford it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the surrounding passengers. A few exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to step in or remain silent. But the woman, unshaken by Linda's hostility, closed her book with deliberate care and placed it on the tray table. Her movements were calm, measured, and dignified. "I'm not sure I follow," she replied, her voice even. "This is my assigned seat." Linda crossed her arms, her tone growing sharper. "Don't play games with me. People like you don't belong here. You must have sneaked in or something." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Nearby passengers began pulling out their phones, recording the unfolding drama. Noticing the commotion, a flight attendant hurried over, her professional smile faltering as the tension in the air became apparent. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. Linda immediately pointed an accusatory finger at the seated woman. "Yes, there is. This woman is in the wrong seat. She doesn't belong in business class. I don't even know how she got here." The flight attendant turned to the black woman, her expression professional yet concerned. "Ma'am, may I please see your boarding pass?" Without hesitation, the woman reached into her bag and handed over the pass. The attendant scanned it carefully, her face betraying nothing. Linda smirked, clearly expecting validation for her claims. But when the attendant returned the pass to its owner with a respectful nod, Linda's smug expression crumbled. "Everything is in order," the flight attendant announced. "This is indeed her assigned seat." Linda's face flushed a deep red, but her indignation refused to waver. "There must be some mistake," she protested. "She can't possibly belong here." By now, nearly every passenger in the cabin was watching the exchange. From a nearby row, a man muttered, "This is unbelievable." Another passenger called out sharply, "Just leave her alone." The black woman finally spoke again, her tone as composed as before. "It's unfortunate that you feel this way," she said, locking eyes with Linda. "But instead of making assumptions, perhaps you should take a moment to ask who I am." Linda blinked, caught off guard. "And just who are you?" she snapped, her words dripping with sarcasm. The woman leaned back in her seat, her poise unbroken. "You'll find out soon enough." The air in the cabin felt heavy with anticipation. What had started as a confrontation over a seat was rapidly escalating into a spectacle. Linda's indignation grew louder, but the quiet strength of the woman she targeted was slowly taking center stage. "If you won't do something about this," Linda said, gesturing wildly at the flight attendant, "I'll take it up with the airline when we land. This is unacceptable." The woman turned her attention briefly to the other passengers, many of whom were now openly recording the scene on their phones. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "I think this is a conversation worth having." Linda's frustration reached a boiling point. She turned back to the flight attendant, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Are you seriously going to let this slide? I paid good money for this seat, and now I'm forced to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." The flight attendant, maintaining her composure despite the rising tension, responded firmly. "Ma'am, I've already verified that this passenger is in her correct seat. There's no issue here." But Linda wasn't ready to relent. "Oh, there's an issue," she spat. "This is about standards. You have a responsibility to uphold them, and this," she gestured dismissively at the woman, "is not acceptable." Across the aisle, a man leaned closer, his voice calm but firm. "You need to stop," he said, his tone measured. "You're embarrassing yourself." Linda spun toward him, her eyes blazing. "Excuse me, this has nothing to do with you. Why don't you mind your own business? The man leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered. Meanwhile, the black woman sat silently, her gaze steady and detached. Her refusal to engage seemed only to further inflame Linda's outrage. And so the tension in the cabin thickened, with everyone wondering how and when this standoff would end. Murmuring angrily under her breath, Linda turned to the flight attendant. "If you won't do your job, I'll find someone who will," she snapped, pulling out her phone and furiously typing. "I'll file a formal complaint," she muttered, her frustration boiling over. The flight attendant let out a controlled sigh, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "my responsibility is to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone on board. I've already explained that this passenger is in her assigned seat. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter to the captain." Linda froze, momentarily taken aback by the warning. But rather than backing down, she doubled down. "Fine," she sneered. "Call the captain. Let's see what he has to say about this." The tension in the cabin was palpable, almost suffocating. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others continued recording the unfolding scene on their phones. As the flight attendant walked away to consult her colleagues, Linda turned her venom back to the seated black woman. "I don't know who you think you are," she spat, her voice laced with malice. "But clearly, you're used to taking things that don't belong to you." The woman, who had remained calm throughout, finally leaned forward slightly. Her voice was steady and measured. "And I don't know who you think you are," she replied, her tone unshaken. "But your words say far more about you than they ever could about me." Linda faltered for a moment, caught off guard. Her mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came out. The woman continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about a seat," she said. "It's about the assumptions you've made. Assumptions that have nothing to do with me and everything to do with how you see the world." Linda blinked, momentarily speechless, before her indignation reignited. "Don't try to lecture me," she snapped, her voice rising. "I've seen enough to know when something's not right." At that moment, a second flight attendant arrived. Her demeanor was professional but firm. "Ma'am," she addressed Linda, her voice calm yet resolute, "we need to resolve this issue immediately. If you cannot comply with our staff's instructions, we will have no choice but to ask you to leave the aircraft." Linda's face flushed crimson. "You're kidding me," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with outrage. "You're going to kick me off this flight because I'm standing up for what's right?" The second flight attendant didn't flinch. "Ma'am," she said evenly, "our priority is the safety and comfort of all passengers. Your behavior is disrupting the cabin, and we cannot allow this to continue." Linda looked around the cabin, her eyes darting from one passenger to the next, searching for allies. But all she found were looks of disapproval, exhaustion, and discomfort. Most passengers avoided her gaze altogether, unwilling to get involved. Meanwhile, the black woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Her demeanor suggested that this wasn't her first encounter with such hostility. She glanced at Linda, her expression steady but not unkind. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it's better to listen than to speak." Linda scoffed, her anger simmering just below the surface. But she said nothing in response. The second flight attendant gave Linda one final warning. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firm, "this is your last chance to comply. If you do not calm down and follow instructions, we will be forced to take further action." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Linda sat back in her seat, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths as she glared at the black woman with barely concealed disdain. The air in the cabin grew heavier with each passing moment. Near the back of the business class section, a man in a navy suit leaned toward his companion. "What's her problem?" he whispered. "She can't handle the idea of someone not like her sitting here," his companion replied, shaking her head in disbelief. Across the aisle, a young woman turned on her phone's camera, aiming it squarely at Linda. "This is going viral," she whispered to her neighbor. "I can't believe people still act like this." Linda, oblivious to the growing disapproval around her, crossed her arms and huffed loudly. "If no one else is going to do something," she muttered, half to herself and half to the flight attendant still standing nearby. I guess I'll have to take matters into my own hands. She stood abruptly, towering over the seated woman. Her voice rose once more, ringing out over the murmurs of the other passengers. If you think you can just sit here and act like you belong, you're sorely mistaken. The black woman looked up at Linda, her expression one of quiet resolve. You've made your opinion very clear, she said, her voice steady. But this is my seat, and I'm not going anywhere. Linda's face flushed a deeper shade of red. Unbelievable, she exclaimed. This is what happens when standards fall. People just walk all over you. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, turning into audible objections. Whispers became voices, and the weight of collective disapproval pressed against Linda as passengers began to speak their minds. Sit down and stop embarrassing yourself. A voice called from a few rows back, cutting through the growing tension. Leave her alone, another passenger added, frustration evident in their tone. Linda's eyes darted around the cabin, scanning for allies. But instead of support, all she found were disapproving stares and heads shaking in disbelief. A middle-aged woman from economy class leaned forward, her voice sharp and unwavering. Ma'am, you're the one out of line here. Sit down and let the rest of us enjoy the flight. Linda's indignation reignited. You don't understand, she shouted, her voice trembling with righteous fury. This isn't about me. It's about what's right. The murmurs of discontent swelled into a chorus of frustration. Passengers exchanged incredulous looks, some speaking in hushed tones, others louder, their disapproval palpable. The flight attendants stood to the side, their glances uneasy as they tried to manage the escalating situation without further inflaming tensions. Through it all, the black woman at the center of Linda's tirade remained composed. She sat as if she were the eye of a storm, calm, still, and unshaken. At one point she glanced around at the passengers and offered a faint, reassuring smile that seemed to say, "Thank you, but I can handle this." Linda, however, was far from finished. She turned back to the flight attendants, her voice trembling with outrage. Are you just going to let her disrespect me like this? I'm a paying customer. I demand action. One of the flight attendants stepped forward, her voice firm but diplomatic. Ma'am, I must ask you to lower your voice and return to your seat. We've already verified that this passenger is exactly where she's supposed to be. There's nothing more to discuss. Linda's jaw dropped as if the suggestion was beyond comprehension. Lower my voice? I will not lower my voice, not when this charade is happening right in front of me. From the row behind, a young man called out loudly, Just stop already. You're the only one causing a problem here. An older woman near the front chimed in, her voice sharp. Enough. Let her be. Linda spun around, her eyes darting from face to face. Her voice wavered as she tried to assert control. Why is everyone against me? Can't you see what's happening here? It's you, said the man in the navy suit, his tone cold and measured. You're the problem. Linda faltered, her bravado slipping as his words hit their mark. For a moment, she seemed unsure of what to do. But instead of retreating, she turned back to the black woman, desperation now dripping from her words. Why don't you just admit it? She demanded. You don't belong here. Why can't you just go back to where you came from? The entire cabin went silent. The weight of Linda's words hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and oppressive. The black woman sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Slowly she rose from her seat, her every movement deliberate and graceful. The passengers watched in stunned silence, their breaths held in anticipation of what she might do or say next. Finally she spoke, her voice calm yet carrying a quiet authority that cut through the silence. I think it's time for you to sit down, ma'am, she said. This isn't about me anymore. It's about you and the kind of person you want to be. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since the ordeal began, she seemed to falter. The woman's calm demeanor and unshakable poise had pierced through Linda's bluster, leaving her face to face with the uncomfortable weight of her own actions. The cabin remained silent, every passenger waiting to see what would happen next. The woman remained standing, her presence commanding, yet serene. Though she had just weathered a storm of accusations, her composure seemed untouched. Passengers exchanged curious glances, wondering who she was and where she drew such unwavering confidence. Her name was Dr. Naomi Carter, though it wasn't yet known to everyone aboard. It was a name that carried weight in the world of business and social advocacy, a name synonymous with resilience and progress. Naomi's journey began far from the luxuries of business class. Born in the modest neighborhood of Franklin Heights, a small yet vibrant community in the heart of Elmwood, she grew up in a household where wisdom and warmth were abundant, even if material comforts were not. Her parents, both school teachers, instilled in her a deep respect for education and hard work. "The world may not always recognize your worth," her mother would say, "but don't let that dim your light." As a child, Naomi was a voracious reader, devouring books about trailblazing women and the civil rights movement. Her favorite was a biography of Audre Lorde, whose powerful words, "Your silence will not protect you," became a guiding mantra in Naomi's life. But growing up Black in America was not without its trials. Naomi's intelligence and ambition often set her apart, placing her in spaces where she was the only person of color. The prejudice she faced was both overt and subtle. Teachers doubted her abilities, classmates mocked her aspirations, and authority figures questioned her presence. Yet Naomi persevered. Her determination earned her a full scholarship to the prestigious Winfield University, where she majored in economics with a focus on organizational leadership. She graduated summa cum laude, her academic excellence a testament to her resilience and drive. Still, breaking into the corporate world was a steep uphill climb. Naomi faced rejection after rejection, often hearing thinly veiled dismissals like, "You're impressive, but we're looking for someone who fits our culture." Rather than letting these obstacles define her, Naomi used them as fuel. She went on to earn an MBA at Bradford University, where she refined her vision for inclusive leadership. Naomi's big break came when she was hired as the operations director for a struggling regional airline. Through her innovative strategies and tireless work ethic, she transformed the company into one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. Within a decade, she rose to become the CEO, one of the few Black women to ever lead a major corporation. But for Naomi, success was never just about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about building a legacy of inclusivity and change. Her presence on that plane wasn't by chance. It was the culmination of years of challenges, triumphs, and unwavering determination, a story that was about to become very clear to everyone on board. Dr. Naomi Carter graduated at the top of her class from Ashwood University with a degree in business administration, specializing in organizational leadership. Her honors, including graduating summa cum laude, reflected her exceptional dedication and intellect. However, her path into the corporate world was fraught with challenges. Despite her stellar credentials, Naomi found herself repeatedly overlooked for opportunities. "You're impressive," one interviewer had told her, "but we're looking for someone who fits our culture better." The thinly veiled rejection stung deeply. But Naomi wasn't the kind of person to let setbacks define her. She used these moments of dismissal as motivation. Determined to refine her skills and expand her vision, she pursued her MBA at the prestigious Walton Business School. There, she honed her expertise in strategic planning and crafted her vision of what truly inclusive leadership could look like. Her first breakthrough came when she joined a struggling regional airline, Skyreach Air, as an operations manager. Naomi threw herself into the role with determination and ingenuity. Through innovative strategies, she transformed the company from a floundering operation into one of the fastest-growing airlines in the nation. Her success did not go unnoticed. Within a decade, Naomi rose to the position of CEO, becoming one of the few Black women to lead a major airline. But for Naomi, leadership was never just about titles or profits. She had a mission: to foster a corporate culture that valued diversity, respect, and inclusion. Naomi implemented robust programs to recruit and support underrepresented talent within the aviation industry. For her, leadership wasn't about issuing commands. It's about listening, learning, and lifting others up, she often told her team, echoing the lessons instilled in her by her parents. Outside of work, Naomi was equally dedicated to her principles. She became a vocal advocate for social justice, frequently speaking at conferences and mentoring young women of color. Her goal was to help them break barriers in their own lives and careers. For all her accomplishments, however, Naomi harbored no illusions about the world she navigated. Her position didn't shield her from prejudice. If anything, it magnified the challenges, making her more determined to confront them with poise and grace. This strength was on full display in the airplane cabin that day, as she faced Linda's hostility with unflinching composure. Naomi could have easily ended the confrontation by declaring her title as CEO. Instead, she chose to embody the values she believed in, showing dignity in the face of ignorance. For Naomi, this moment wasn't merely about asserting her place on the flight. It was about demonstrating to everyone, including Linda, what true strength and resilience looked like. As she glanced around the cabin, Naomi's eyes met those of a young girl seated a few rows back. The girl watched the scene unfold with wide-eyed curiosity. Naomi recognized herself in that child, a young girl who needed to see that it was possible to rise above prejudice and stand tall in the face of ignorance. Choosing her words carefully, Naomi addressed the cabin. Her voice was steady but firm, carrying the weight of her experience. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about how we choose to treat one another, how we respond to what we think we know about someone. My hope is that by the time this flight is over, we'll all have something to reflect on." The passengers listened, captivated by the quiet power of her words. Though they didn't yet know the full extent of Naomi's story, her presence commanded respect. Naomi Carter wasn't just another traveler in business class. She was a living testament to what could be achieved through perseverance, grace, and a steadfast commitment to one's principles. In stark contrast, Linda Patterson, the woman at the center of the disruption, rarely found herself in the spotlight for the right reasons. A suburban mother in her late 40s, Linda carried an air of self-assuredness that often bordered on entitlement. Her world had always been a familiar one, structured, predictable, and comfortable. Linda grew up in a middle-class household in the quiet town of Riverbrook, surrounded by people who looked and thought much like her. Her upbringing, while supportive, was sheltered, shaped by the unspoken assumptions of her homogeneous community. Linda didn't see herself as malicious. She genuinely believed she was a good person. But years of unchecked biases had crystallized into a worldview that was difficult to challenge. After college, Linda married her high school sweetheart, settling into a life she had envisioned for herself. She became deeply involved in her local community, serving on PTA boards and spearheading neighborhood fundraisers. But beneath her outward involvement was a simmering frustration, a nagging sense that her contributions were often overlooked or undervalued. This undercurrent of dissatisfaction sometimes found its outlet in her interactions with others. Linda had developed a habit of asserting her authority in public spaces, particularly when she felt slighted or ignored. Whether it was demanding to speak to the manager at a store or loudly challenging perceived slights, Linda saw herself as a champion of fairness. To her, her actions weren't driven by prejudice. They were about upholding standards, or so she told herself. But her version of fairness often aligned suspiciously with her own convenience and comfort. On the day of the flight, Linda had splurged on a business-class ticket as a reward for herself. She imagined a luxurious, peaceful journey, but when she saw Naomi seated near her, poised and confident, something inside her bristled. It wasn't jealousy, Linda convinced herself. It was suspicion. How could someone like her afford this seat, she thought, the question lingering and festering until it became a certainty in her mind that something wasn't right. And in true Linda fashion, she felt compelled to act. What Linda couldn't or wouldn't see was that her reaction wasn't about fairness or rules. It was about her own discomfort with a reality that challenged her unexamined assumptions. And as the situation escalated, Linda's refusal to confront her biases became painfully clear, to herself and to everyone around her. Linda often prided herself on her commitment to fairness, or at least her interpretation of it. She valued rules and order, but her understanding of these concepts was often limited by her narrow perspective. For Linda, fairness frequently aligned with her personal convenience and comfort. This flight was no exception. Linda had splurged on a business-class ticket, justifying the expense as a well-deserved reward for her hard work. For weeks, she had envisioned herself reclining in luxury, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of premium travel. However, her expectations were quickly upended when she boarded the plane and saw a black woman seated near her, dressed impeccably and radiating quiet confidence. Linda's initial reaction wasn't one of curiosity or admiration. Instead, something inside her bristled. It wasn't jealousy, she assured herself. It was suspicion. How could someone like her afford this seat? Linda thought. The question gnawed at her, morphing into an unshakable conviction that something wasn't right. True to her nature, Linda felt compelled to act. What Linda failed to realize, what she couldn't allow herself to see, was that her reaction wasn't about rules, fairness, or any perceived discrepancy. It was about her discomfort with a reality that challenged her assumptions. And as the situation escalated, her inability to confront her biases became painfully clear, not just to herself, but to everyone around her. The flight itself began like any other. It was a routine trip on Midland Airways, a mid-sized airline catering to business travelers, families, and vacationers. The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-departure activity. Passengers stowing luggage, adjusting their seats, and exchanging polite smiles with flight attendants. The business class section exuded sophistication with its plush leather seats and soft ambient lighting, a stark contrast to the crowded energy of the economy cabin just beyond the curtain. This particular flight was bound for Bridgeport, a bustling city renowned as a hub of opportunity and ambition. The passengers reflected this diversity. Seasoned professionals working on laptops, families flipping through travel guides, and young couples quietly discussing their plans. In one of the window seats, Dr. Naomi Carter, the black woman who would soon become the center of attention, sat reading a well-worn book. Her serene demeanor radiated an aura of quiet self-assurance. Linda arrived shortly after, scanning the cabin with a critical eye. For a while, everything seemed ordinary. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, offering pre-flight refreshments as passengers settled in, anticipating a smooth journey. But tranquility gave way to tension when Linda's assumptions collided with reality. The first sign of trouble came as Linda's voice rose above the cabin's soft murmur. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, gesturing toward Naomi with an air of righteous indignation. "How can you let someone like her sit here without checking? Are there even rules anymore?" A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered quietly among themselves. The flight attendant approached cautiously, her expression a blend of professionalism and concern. She had already assessed the situation and knew it required delicate handling. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "as I've mentioned, this passenger is in her assigned seat. We've verified her boarding pass and there's no issue here. Please return to your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." But Linda wasn't satisfied. "No, this isn't just about her boarding pass," she snapped. "This is about how she got here in the first place. You don't just walk into business class without earning it." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, with several passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Why doesn't she just let it go?" one man muttered under his breath. "This is getting out of hand," whispered a woman seated nearby. Naomi, however, remained composed. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her calm demeanor an unspoken contrast to Linda's escalating fury. When the flight attendant looked at her, Naomi offered a small, reassuring nod, as if to say, "I'll be fine." The flight attendant turned back to Linda, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "I must ask you to lower your voice. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter to the captain." Linda froze, her face flushing with a mix of anger and disbelief. "The captain?" she repeated, as though the very idea were absurd. "Why don't you just fix this instead of threatening me? I'm not the one causing a problem here." The attendant's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am," she said, her tone unwavering, "this is your final warning. Please return to your seat so we can proceed with the flight." Linda crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. It was clear she had no intention of backing down. Turning to the other passengers, her voice rose again. "Is everyone okay with this?" she demanded. "Are we just going to ignore the fact that this whole situation is suspicious?" Her attempt to rally support failed spectacularly. "You're the only one making this an issue," called a young man sitting across the aisle, his tone sharp. "Just sit down and let us take off." Another passenger chimed in, her voice tinged with exasperation. Linda's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But all she found were expressions of disapproval and exhaustion. "You're the only one making this an issue," a young man's voice cut through the murmurs, frustration evident. "Sit down and stop ruining the flight for everyone." Another passenger added sharply, "No one cares about your opinion. Just let her be." Linda's face flushed a deeper shade of red. She opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could respond, a second flight attendant arrived, accompanied by the purser. The purser, an experienced crew member with a calm but commanding presence, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, "we understand your concerns, but we've reviewed the situation and everything is in order. If you cannot comply with our instructions, we will have no choice but to ask you to leave the aircraft." Linda's jaw dropped, her indignation quickly shifting to disbelief. "You're kidding me," she exclaimed, her voice rising again. "You're going to kick me off this flight just because I'm asking questions? What kind of airline is this?" For the first time, Dr. Naomi Carter spoke directly to Linda. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Ma'am," she said, meeting Linda's gaze, "I think it's time to stop this. It's clear that you've made up your mind about me, but perhaps you should take a moment to ask yourself why." Linda faltered, caught off guard by Naomi's calm yet pointed words. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Linda's response. The purser stepped in again, his voice unwavering. "Ma'am, we need to resolve this now. Please return to your seat, or we will have to involve airport security." Linda glanced around the cabin, her eyes darting between the flight crew and the passengers who were now openly staring at her. It was clear she had no allies. With no other option, she reluctantly sat down, though her crossed arms and stiff posture made it clear she was far from defeated. Naomi exhaled quietly, picking up her book with the same poise she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Though outwardly calm, she understood that the moment of truth was approaching. This situation was far from over, and soon Linda and everyone else on the plane would learn who she truly was. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Linda sat stiffly in her seat, glaring out the window, her arms crossed defensively. The tension from moments before seemed to have condensed around her, isolating her in a bubble of her own making. The flight attendants returned to their duties, though their eyes occasionally flicked toward Linda, ready to intervene if necessary. Naomi, meanwhile, remained composed. Her expression was serene but contemplative, as though she was weighing her next move carefully. She knew the eyes of the entire cabin were on her. Finally, breaking the silence, Naomi addressed the passengers. Her voice carried a quiet authority that drew everyone's attention. "Since there seems to be some confusion," she began, "perhaps I should introduce myself properly." Linda turned her head sharply, her expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Oh, please do," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "This should be good." Naomi stood gracefully, her movements deliberate and measured. She turned to face Linda and the surrounding passengers, meeting Linda's gaze directly. Her calm demeanor remained unshaken. "My name," she said steadily, "is Dr. Naomi Carter. I'm the CEO of this airline." The words landed like a thunderclap. Linda's face went pale, her confident facade crumbling in an instant. "What?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Naomi continued, her tone even but firm. "I oversee every aspect of this airline, from its operations to its commitment to customer service. I've dedicated years of my life to building a company that values diversity, respect, and excellence. And yet here I am, being told by one of my own passengers that I don't belong in the seat I paid for." Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her mind raced, struggling to reconcile the confident, composed woman standing before her with the assumptions she had made just moments earlier. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The disbelief that initially swept through them quickly gave way to murmurs of approval and support. "She's the CEO?" someone whispered. "No wonder she handled that so well," another passenger replied. Linda, still reeling, attempted to recover. I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice trembling. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained serious. "No, you didn't realize," she said. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You made assumptions about me without knowing anything about who I am or what I've done. And those assumptions led you to act in a way that disrespected not just me, but yourself and everyone else on this flight." Linda's face flushed with embarrassment. The bravado that had fueled her earlier outbursts was now replaced by a palpable sense of regret. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Naomi nodded, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Apologies are a start," she said. "But what matters more is what you do next. How you choose to treat people moving forward." The cabin erupted in quiet applause. The tension that had gripped the passengers finally began to dissipate, replaced by admiration for Naomi's grace and poise. Linda sank deeper into her seat, her gaze fixed firmly on her lap. The weight of her actions and their consequences bore heavily on her. For Naomi, the confrontation wasn't just a moment of personal vindication. It was an opportunity to demonstrate dignity and resilience, a lesson not just for Linda, but for everyone on board. As admiration for Dr. Naomi Carter's composure spread through the cabin, Linda sank deeper into her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The weight of her actions pressed heavily upon her, her earlier confidence now reduced to a quiet discomfort. Naomi returned to her seat with the same deliberate calm she had shown throughout the ordeal. She opened her book to the page she had marked, her expressions serene. As she glanced around the cabin, she noticed subtle smiles and respectful nods from passengers. She hadn't needed anger or indignation to make her point. She had done it through dignity and unwavering resolve. Linda's lesson had been hard-earned, but its resonance extended far beyond her. For a moment, the cabin was filled with stunned silence, each passenger grappling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Then, almost as if on cue, quiet murmurs began to ripple through the rows. "She's the CEO? I can't believe it," someone whispered. "No wonder she handled that so well," another voice replied, tinged with admiration. The brief applause that had erupted earlier gave way to hushed conversations. Passengers leaned toward their neighbors, processing the events with a mixture of astonishment and respect. A young woman sitting a few rows behind Linda turned to her companion, her eyes wide. "That was incredible," she said. "She didn't even lose her temper. If it were me, I don't think I could have kept my cool." Her companion nodded, his gaze shifting toward Naomi, who had resumed reading as though nothing had happened. "That's real strength," he said, "standing up for yourself without stooping to their level." Linda, meanwhile, remained slumped in her seat. Her face betrayed a mix of embarrassment and regret. Though most passengers had turned their attention back to their own conversations, Linda could still feel their gazes, some pitying, others disapproving. Across the aisle, an older woman spoke up, her voice firm enough to carry through the cabin. "I hope we all learned something today," she said. "Judging someone without knowing them is a reflection of our own flaws, not theirs." A middle-aged man in a crisp suit chimed in. "She handled that with more grace than most people ever could," he said. "Honestly, that's what leadership looks like." A ripple of agreement swept through the cabin as passengers nodded and murmured in assent. For many, Naomi's calm and measured response had been more than a lesson in dignity. It was an example of how to navigate difficult situations with integrity and composure. Toward the back of the business class section, a teenage girl lifted her phone, which had been recording much of the confrontation. "I'm posting this," she told her mother. "People need to see how she handled that." Her mother hesitated, glancing toward Naomi. "Just be respectful," she said. "This isn't about shaming anyone. It's about showing what real respect looks like." Linda overheard the exchange and winced visibly. She turned slightly in her seat, as if to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Her earlier bravado was long gone, leaving her uncertain of how, or if, she could make amends. In the economy cabin, passengers who hadn't been able to witness the scene firsthand were now hearing about it through whispers and retellings. "Can you believe it? The CEO stood up to all that prejudice with total grace," one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. Another passenger, a man in his early 30s, leaned toward his seatmate. "You know," he said, "I think this kind of thing happens more often than we'd like to admit. People make assumptions all the time, but it's rare to see someone handle it like that." His seatmate, an older woman with a kind face, nodded in agreement. "She didn't just teach Linda a lesson," she said softly. She taught all of us something important today. As the murmurs continued, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, ensuring passengers were ready for takeoff. One of them paused by Naomi's seat, her expression a blend of gratitude and admiration. "Thank you for handling that the way you did, Dr. Carter," she said quietly. "I don't think many people could have managed it as gracefully as you did." Naomi looked up from her book, her calm smile returning. "Thank you," she said softly. "Sometimes the best way to address ignorance is to let it speak for itself." The attendant nodded, her respect evident before moving on to her duties. As the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, the energy in the cabin shifted. The earlier tension had dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of admiration for Naomi's resilience. For Linda, however, the weight of her actions remained heavy. She sat in silence, staring down at her hands as her mind replayed the confrontation over and over. Her earlier certainty had been replaced by a gnawing regret, a stark realization of the impact her words had carried. Linda replayed the confrontation in her mind, over and over. The whispers around her had shifted. They were no longer filled with judgment but were now quiet reminders of the lesson she had just learned, a lesson she knew she wouldn't forget anytime soon. As the applause and murmurs began to fade, Dr. Naomi Carter glanced around the cabin. She met the gazes of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. Her calm expression betrayed no anger, no frustration, only a quiet resolve. Naomi stood once more, not out of defiance, but to address the tension that still lingered in the air. Her voice, soft yet steady, cut through the silence. "Thank you all for your support," she began, addressing the passengers. "But I want to take a moment to reflect on what just happened. Not to point fingers, but to consider the lessons we can all learn from this." Linda, still sitting stiffly in her seat, avoided Naomi's gaze. Her face flushed, her earlier bravado completely gone. She fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, as if trying to shrink under the weight of what had transpired. Naomi turned her attention to Linda. Her tone was gentle but firm. "Ma'am," she said, "I understand that your words came from a place of assumption. We all carry biases, whether we realize it or not, but the way we choose to act on those biases is what defines us." Linda glanced up briefly, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and discomfort. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "I don't hold this against you. In fact, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, not just for us, but for everyone here." Turning to the rest of the passengers, Naomi spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years navigating adversity. "We live in a world that often teaches us to judge others based on appearances, assumptions, and preconceived notions. But those judgments don't just limit the people we judge, they limit us. They rob us of the chance to see the full humanity in each other." A passenger in the back nodded in agreement. Another murmured softly, "She's absolutely right." Naomi continued, her voice filled with compassion. "Moments like these aren't opportunities to shame. They're opportunities to learn. I hope we can all take this as a reminder to approach each other with more empathy and less judgment." The cabin remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Linda, now visibly emotional, whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, barely audible, but it was enough to draw Naomi's attention. Naomi smiled gently. "Thank you," she said. "Apologies are important, but what matters most is what we do moving forward, how we choose to treat others, especially those who challenge our assumptions." With that, she returned to her seat. Her movements were deliberate, her poise unbroken, as she reopened her book. But the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The tension that had once gripped the passengers was now replaced by a quiet sense of unity and reflection. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. Some nodded subtly, as if to say, "We'll remember this." For Linda, the moment was humbling in a way she hadn't expected. Naomi's grace and forgiveness didn't absolve her. Instead, they made her realize how much she still had to learn. Though the lesson had been a difficult one, it was a lesson she knew she would carry with her long after the flight had landed. As the plane taxied back to the gate due to the disruption, Linda sat in her seat, avoiding the eyes of everyone around her. The once confident woman who had raised her voice and pointed fingers now seemed small and uncertain. The weight of the confrontation and the murmurs of judgment from the other passengers bore heavily on her shoulders. When the announcement came that Linda would need to deboard the plane, she hesitated, clutching her purse tightly. The purser approached her seat, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, we need you to gather your belongings and leave the aircraft. This is for the comfort and safety of everyone on board." Linda glanced around the cabin. Some passengers were openly watching her, while others turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. No one spoke in her defense. The realization hit her like a wave. Her actions had not only embarrassed her, but had isolated her completely. Slowly, Linda stood. Her movements were hesitant, as though the act of standing was an admission of defeat. Gathering her things, she walked down the aisle, her face flushed with a mix of shame and regret. The hum of the plane seemed louder in the silence that followed her steps. Naomi, still seated, watched Linda leave with a composed yet empathetic expression. As Linda passed, Naomi gave her a subtle nod, not one of approval, but one of understanding. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of forgiveness and hope for change. When Linda stepped off the plane, the door closed behind her with a finality that made her shoulders slump. Linda paused in the terminal, her shoulders slumped as she looked back at the aircraft through the large glass windows. Her mind replayed the events that had just unfolded. She didn't feel angry anymore. Instead, there was a hollow realization that her assumptions and biases had dictated her actions. She had boarded the plane expecting to feel justified, even righteous. Instead, she felt exposed, her flaws laid bare for all to see. As the plane prepared for departure without her, Linda sat at a bench near the terminal window, staring at her reflection in the glass. Dr. Naomi Carter's words echoed in her mind. What matters most is what we do moving forward. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was unusually subdued. The earlier confrontation had left a lingering tension in the air, but it had also sparked quiet conversations among the passengers. Dr. Carter's grace in the face of Linda's hostility weighed heavily on everyone, prompting reflection on their own assumptions and biases. Toward the back of the business class section, a young woman in her mid-20s clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Her name was Maya Jackson, a marketing associate on her way to her first major work presentation in Bridgeport. Maya had been silent during the confrontation, watching intently but saying nothing. Now, as the hum of the engines filled the cabin, she felt an overwhelming urge to speak. Leaning slightly forward, she addressed the passengers seated nearby. "You know," she began, her voice hesitant at first, "what just happened reminded me of something I went through a few years ago." The older man seated next to her turned his attention toward her, his expression curious but encouraging. "Go on," he said gently. Maya hesitated, glancing around as though ensuring it was safe to share her story. Then, taking a deep breath, she began. "I was in college, working as a waitress at a small diner to help pay for tuition. One evening, I was serving a mix of families and regulars when a man came in. He was dressed in a suit, looking very out of place. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee." She paused, her voice catching slightly as she recalled the memory. At first, everything seemed fine. But then he started making comments. He looked me up and down and said things like, "You must be used to serving people like me, huh?" The man beside her frowned. "What happened next?" he asked. Maya looked down at her hands, her voice soft but steady. "It got worse. He started asking me questions. Where I was from, why I was working there. Then he said it, 'People like you don't usually make it far, do they?'" She paused, her voice trembling slightly. I froze. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, feeling so small and so humiliated. Across the aisle, an older woman leaned in, her eyes filled with empathy. "What did you do?" she asked softly. Maya swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything. I couldn't. I just kept serving him, trying to hold back tears. But that night, when I got home, I cried for hours. Not just because of what he said, but because a part of me believed him. I started to think that maybe I wasn't good enough. That no matter how hard I worked, I'd always be seen as less." A heavy silence followed her words. Passengers nodded solemnly, their faces reflecting a mix of sadness and understanding. Dr. Carter, seated nearby, turned slightly in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "Maya," she said softly, her voice warm and reassuring, "thank you for sharing that. It takes courage to speak about these experiences." Maya looked up, her eyes meeting Naomi's. "Thank you," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Watching you handle what just happened, I don't know how you stayed so calm. I don't think I could have done that." Naomi smiled gently. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But over the years, I've learned that the best way to fight ignorance is to rise above it, not because it's fair, but because it's necessary. You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you respond." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I guess I still have a lot to learn about that." Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman wearing a colorful scarf spoke up. "You're not alone, Maya," she said. "I think we all have a lot to learn. What we witnessed today was a master class in dignity, and it's something I'll carry with me for a long time." The sentiment resonated with the passengers. One by one, they began to share their thoughts and experiences, the cabin transforming into a space for collective reflection. A man in his 40s, seated a few rows ahead, turned around to join the conversation. "I grew up in a small town," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "And I'll be honest, I had a lot of the same assumptions Linda had today. I didn't even realize they were wrong until I moved to the city and started meeting people who challenged everything I thought I knew." The woman in the scarf nodded. "That's the thing about prejudice," she said. "It's not always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's the quiet assumptions we carry without even questioning them. But seeing someone like Dr. Carter stand up with such grace, it makes you want to be better." Maya smiled faintly, a sense of hope beginning to replace the heaviness in her chest. "Maybe that's the lesson here," she said softly, "that even when we feel powerless, we can still choose to rise above. Like Dr. Carter said, we can't control how others see us, but we can control how we respond." Naomi nodded, her gaze moving across the cabin as though addressing everyone at once. "That's exactly it," she said. "And the more we choose empathy and understanding over judgment, the more we create a world where moments like this become less common." The cabin grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't heavy or tense, it was reflective, almost hopeful. The passengers, once strangers, now shared a connection forged in the wake of a powerful moment. "Watching Dr. Carter today reminded me how important it is to keep learning," the man in his 40s finished, his voice tinged with regret. The woman in the colorful scarf nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about prejudice. It's not always loud and obvious," she said. "Sometimes it's the quiet assumptions we carry with us, the ones we don't even question. But seeing someone like Dr. Carter stand up with such grace, it makes you want to be better." Maya smiled faintly, a sense of hope replacing the heaviness that had weighed on her. "Maybe that's the lesson here," she said softly. "That even when we feel powerless, we can still choose to rise above. Like Dr. Carter said, we can't control how others see us, but we can control how we respond." Naomi nodded, her gaze sweeping across the cabin as if addressing everyone. "That's exactly it," she said. "And the more we choose empathy and understanding over judgment, the more we create a world where moments like this become less common." The cabin grew quiet again, but this time the silence was reflective, almost hopeful. The passengers, once strangers, now shared a connection forged in the wake of a powerful moment. As the plane continued its journey, the hum of the engines carried a collective resolve to be better, to do better, and to treat one another with dignity and respect. Meanwhile, Linda sat alone in the terminal, staring blankly at the floor. The bustling activity of travelers rushing to their gates felt distant, like white noise she couldn't quite tune into. Her mind replayed the events on the plane, the stares, the murmurs of disapproval, and most of all, Dr. Carter's calm, unwavering words. "You assume things about me without knowing anything about who I am. But those assumptions say more about you than they do about me." The words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront a truth she had long avoided. Linda had always prided herself on being a good person, someone who stood up for what was right. But today, she had seen a version of herself that was anything but good. Pulling her phone from her bag, she scrolled absently through her emails and social media, searching for a distraction. Instead, a notification appeared. CEO of Airline handles passengers' outburst with absolute grace. Her heart sank. She didn't need to watch the video to know what it contained. The confrontation, her words, her actions, all of it laid bare for the world to see. But what stung most wasn't the public humiliation. It was the realization that she deserved it. For years, Linda had carried unspoken biases, assumptions she had never questioned because they felt so natural, so ingrained. She wasn't a hateful person, she told herself. She didn't discriminate. But wasn't that what everyone believed until they were forced to face the evidence? She sighed deeply, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. Dr. Carter's grace had been the most painful part of it all. Linda had expected anger, retaliation, maybe even vindictive satisfaction. Instead, she had been met with kindness, understanding, and a challenge to do better. Her mind wandered back to Dr. Carter's final words. What matters most is what you do moving forward. Looking around the terminal, Linda watched the sea of travelers from all walks of life moving through the space. For the first time, she didn't just see a crowd. She saw individuals, each with their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. Pulling out her phone again, Linda opened a new email draft. She stared at the blank screen for a long moment before typing the subject line, "Apology and Reflection." Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating briefly, before she began to type. The email wasn't just an apology to Dr. Carter. It was a commitment to herself, to unlearn the biases that had shaped her worldview for so long. As Linda wrote, she felt something unfamiliar: hope. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, Linda was ready to face it. As the plane touched down in Bridgeport, the world outside had already begun to react to what had unfolded at 35,000 feet. By the time passengers disembarked and turned their phones back on, the video of the confrontation between Linda and Dr. Carter had spread like wildfire across social media. The footage, captured by multiple passengers, showed Linda's outburst, Naomi's composed response, and the eventual revelation of her identity as CEO of the airline. But it wasn't just the events themselves that captivated viewers. It was the stark contrast between Linda's hostility and Naomi's unwavering grace. Within hours, hashtags like "Grace Under Pressure," "Rise Above Hate," and "Naomi Carter CEO" began trending on Twitter and Instagram. Clips of the incident racked up millions of views, with captions praising Naomi's dignity and poise. The internet, true to form, responded with a mix of outrage, humor, and introspection. On one hand, there was a wave of condemnation directed at Linda. Comments flooded in. "People like her are the reason we can't have nice things. When will people learn that judging others based on assumptions makes them look ignorant? This woman just embarrassed herself in front of the entire world." Memes quickly followed. One featured a picture of Linda's flushed face with the caption, "When you mess with the CEO and lose." Another juxtaposed an image of Naomi sitting calmly with the words, "Elegance isn't an outfit, it's a state of mind." However, alongside the mockery, a more thoughtful conversation began to emerge. Many users highlighted Naomi's response as a model for handling prejudice with grace and dignity. One viral tweet read, "Dr. Naomi Carter didn't just teach Linda a lesson, she taught all of us. Her composure, her words, and her ability to rise above the hate are what we should all aspire to." Another user wrote, "The way she calmly said, 'You should ask who I am before assuming,' that's power, quiet, dignified, and unshakable." The internet, true to its nature, responded with a mix of outrage, humor, and introspection. On one hand, a wave of condemnation was directed at Linda. Comments flooded social media. "People like her are the reason we can't have nice things. When will people learn that judging others based on assumptions makes them look ignorant? This woman just embarrassed herself in front of the entire world." Memes quickly followed. One featured a picture of Linda's flushed face with the caption, "When you mess with the CEO and lose." Another juxtaposed an image of Dr. Naomi Carter sitting calmly with the words, "Elegance isn't an outfit, it's a state of mind." However, alongside the mockery, a more thoughtful conversation began to emerge. Many users highlighted Naomi's reaction as a model for how to handle prejudice with grace and dignity. One viral tweet read, "Dr. Naomi Carter didn't just teach Linda a lesson, she taught all of us. Her composure, her words, and her ability to rise above hate are what we should all aspire to." Another user wrote, "The way she calmly said, 'You should ask who I am before assuming,' that's power, quiet, dignified, and absolutely unshakable." The story quickly gained traction with major news outlets. Headlines such as "CEO confronts prejudice with poise" and "Airline leader inspires millions after onboard incident" dominated news feeds. Interviews with passengers who witnessed the event further fueled the narrative, painting Naomi as a symbol of resilience and leadership. Naomi herself became a sought-after figure, with journalists eager to hear her perspective. But instead of exploiting the moment for personal gain, she used her platform to address broader issues. In a carefully worded statement released on her social media accounts, Naomi wrote, "What happened on that flight was not unique. Every day, countless people face prejudice and judgment based on nothing more than assumptions. My hope is that this incident can spark a larger conversation about empathy, understanding, and the power of choosing grace over anger. Let's use this as an opportunity to reflect, learn, and grow." Experts in social psychology and diversity training praised Naomi's response, calling it a masterclass in conflict resolution. They noted how her actions diffused the situation while still holding Linda accountable in a way that encouraged reflection rather than retaliation. For Linda, the aftermath of the incident was deeply humbling. She became the target of widespread criticism online, her face plastered across countless posts and memes. But unlike many in her position, Linda chose to face the fallout head-on. In a surprising turn, she released a public apology through a video on social media. Sitting in a modest, well-lit room with her face free of makeup, Linda addressed the camera with a somber expression. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for my actions on that flight," she began. "Watching the video of myself was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also necessary. I saw a version of myself that I didn't recognize, and it forced me to confront biases I didn't even realize I had. Dr. Carter, if you're watching this, thank you for handling the situation with such grace. You didn't owe me kindness, but you showed it anyway. I'm committed to doing better, to educating myself, and to making sure this kind of behavior never happens again." Linda's apology was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded her for taking accountability, with comments like, "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Growth starts with humility. Good for her." Others, however, remained skeptical, dismissing the video as damage control. Regardless of the differing opinions, Linda's words added another layer to the ongoing conversation about prejudice and personal growth. The viral nature of the incident sparked discussions far beyond social media. Schools, workplaces, and community organizations began using the footage as a teaching tool, emphasizing themes of implicit bias, cultural humility, and the importance of standing up against prejudice. Naomi's airline also took action. They announced new diversity and inclusion initiatives aimed at fostering understanding among passengers and staff. In an internal memo, Naomi wrote, "This is a chance for us to lead by example. We must create spaces where everyone feels valued and respected, not just on our flights, but in every interaction we have." As the story spread, people from all walks of life shared their own experiences of being judged or dismissed based on assumptions. Many found inspiration in Naomi's response, using it as a reminder that dignity and composure are powerful tools for change. The incident became more than just another viral moment. It was a cultural touchpoint, a reminder of the work still needed to combat prejudice and foster empathy. Naomi's ability to rise above hate resonated deeply, showing that the path to change often starts with small, personal acts of courage and understanding. As one Twitter user aptly summarized, "In a world full of anger, be like Dr. Carter, calm, composed, and committed to making things better." Like Dr. Naomi Carter, calm, composed, and committed to making things better. As the viral video of the confrontation faded into the backdrop of an ever-moving news cycle, its impact continued to ripple through society. The incident aboard the plane wasn't just about Linda or Dr. Carter. It became a mirror, forcing individuals and communities to confront their own biases and question the assumptions they often carried unconsciously. Naomi's words lingered in the minds of millions. "You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you respond." These words transcended the moment, resonating as a universal truth about resilience, grace, and the power of choice. Naomi's actions reminded the world that while prejudice and ignorance persist, they can be met with dignity and wisdom, transforming a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth. But the lesson didn't end with Naomi. Linda's journey of self-reflection offered a parallel story, one of accountability and redemption. While she could never erase the hurt caused by her words, her willingness to publicly acknowledge her mistakes and commit to change showed that it is never too late to learn. Linda's apology, though imperfect, underscored an essential truth. Growth begins with humility. The path to becoming a better person is paved with uncomfortable realizations, but it is a journey worth taking. The incident also served as a wake-up call for society at large. In a world increasingly polarized by fear and division, it highlighted the urgent need for empathy and understanding. It showed how small, seemingly innocuous assumptions could snowball into acts of exclusion and harm, perpetuating cycles of inequality and mistrust. Communities, workplaces, and schools began using the story as a case study. It sparked conversations about implicit bias and how systemic prejudice operates in everyday life. Diversity training programs incorporated Naomi's example of grace under pressure as a model for addressing conflict constructively. Her story became a rallying cry for those working toward a more inclusive future, demonstrating that kindness and firmness are not mutually exclusive, but in fact, powerful allies. Perhaps the most profound impact, however, was felt on an individual level. For those who had ever been judged unfairly, whether for their appearance, background, or circumstances, Naomi's composure became a beacon of hope. It reminded them that their worth isn't determined by others' perceptions and that their response to adversity is their true measure of strength. For those who had unknowingly perpetuated prejudice, the story became a moment of reckoning. It urged them to reflect on their actions, to examine their assumptions, and to choose empathy over judgment in their daily lives. The viral video wasn't just a spectacle. It was a mirror, challenging viewers to ask themselves, what kind of person do I want to be? In the end, the flight that had started with tension and division landed with a message of unity and accountability. Naomi's ability to rise above hate didn't just diffuse a moment of conflict. It planted seeds of change in the hearts of those who watched, both on the plane and around the world. As the world continues to grapple with issues of prejudice and misunderstanding, this story stands as a testament to the power of individual actions. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It often begins with a single choice: to listen instead of assume, to understand instead of judge, to respond with dignity, even when faced with ignorance. And so the call to action is simple yet profound. Let us choose to rise above. Let us choose kindness over anger, understanding over prejudice, and respect over division. In doing so, we not only uplift ourselves, but also create a world where everyone, regardless of their background, feels seen, valued, and respected.